In the year 1886, in the heart of Lisbon, a mystery began to take shape within the cold, damp walls of one of the city's most notorious institutions, the asylum. It was not just the patients who filled these walls with whispers and uncertainty. It was the strange, inexplicable phenomena that seemed to emerge out of the darkest corners of human experience. The very concept of madness was still in its infancy at this point, a time when society had only begun to grasp the full complexity of the human mind and its disorders. It was an age where the lines between sanity and insanity were blurred, often dangerously so. In that foggy realm of ignorance and cruel treatments, something even more bizarre began to unfold, something that would remain unexplained, forgotten, until its eerie rediscovery over a century later. At the Lisbon Asylum, a strange pattern emerged, one that would puzzle even the most seasoned doctors of the day. Patients, who had been admitted for various forms of mental illnesses, began to draw something unsettling, something identical. It was as if their minds, fractured and torn by their inner demons, shared a common thread. They did not communicate in typical ways. Instead, they communicated through images, cryptic symbols that were eerily alike, repeating across the asylum's crumbling walls, within the pages of forgotten journals, and scrawled onto the tattered remnants of paper in the dim, flickering light of their cells. What was this? Were these symbols simply the product of collective madness, or were they something more, an expression of a deeper, unspeakable truth that lay hidden beneath the surface of their minds? For decades, these symbols would remain trapped in the dusty asylum files, lost to history. The symbols would fade from memory, like many other mysteries that have been consumed by time, but they never completely vanished. The asylum, its residents, and its dark secrets would eventually be forgotten, tucked away in the annals of Lisbon's history. Yet these strange images, these inexplicable drawings, carried a weight, one that would quietly resurface when the asylum files were rediscovered much later. But by then, it was too late to ask the surviving patients what they had seen, what had driven them to create these identical marks. The records were fragmented, the inmates long gone, their memories only alive in the haunting remnants they left behind. The rediscovery of these drawings in the 21st century sparked a resurgence of interest in the long-forgotten Lisbon Asylum. What had driven these individuals to create such symbols? What did they mean? Were these symbols a simple reflection of their mental states, the frantic attempt of minds pushed to their limits to grasp something beyond their understanding? Or were they something more sinister, something far darker? The answers seemed elusive, but the questions only grew more intriguing. Every turn in the investigation led to more uncertainty. The symbols themselves, intricate and puzzling, became the focal point, a key that could unlock some long-buried truth. But the deeper one dug, the more complex the mystery became. To understand the weight of this discovery, one must first appreciate the context in which it was found. The Lisbon Asylum, located on the outskirts of the city, was one of many such institutions built in the 19th century. At the time, mental illness was often misunderstood, feared, and stigmatized. Conditions like depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety were seen through a lens of ignorance and superstition. Psychiatry, still in its infancy, had no real framework for understanding the complexities of the human mind. The patients at the asylum were often seen not as individuals in need of care and compassion, but as strange, dangerous, and out of control. Their treatment was cruel, experimental, and more about containment than care. It was a place where the line between healer and tormentor was often indistinguishable. In this oppressive atmosphere, the patients, already at the mercy of their mental illness, were subjected to treatments that would be considered barbaric today. There were no medications to calm the mind, no therapies to help patients make sense of their delusions. Instead, they were often locked away, isolated from the world, in institutions like the one in Lisbon. They lived in conditions that were less than human, subject to long periods of confinement, harsh diets, and cruel therapies like water cures, bleeding, and shock treatments. For many, this was not a place of healing. It was a place of degradation and torment, where their minds were pushed further into darkness. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, these strange, identical symbols appeared. The idea that so many patients, some of whom never spoke a word to each other, never shared their experiences, could draw the same thing seemed impossible. How could so many minds, so many different people, come to create the same thing? Was it a coincidence, a shared hallucination, or was there something else? Theories ranged from the plausible to the outlandish. Some believed that the symbols were a reflection of the patient's psychosis, a product of their collective delusions. Others thought they might be a form of communication, one that transcended words, symbols that could convey a truth that language could not. But the truth remained elusive, buried deep within the crumbling asylum walls. As the years passed and the asylum's records were sealed away, those who had been involved with the institution, the doctors, the nurses, the staff, moved on, their memories fading. The symbols were left behind, their meaning lost, their significance forgotten. Until one day, the old files surfaced again, and the mystery was reignited. Scholars, historians, and even paranormal enthusiasts flocked to the records, each eager to uncover the secrets that had been left behind. Yet, the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. What did these symbols mean? Were they an expression of mental illness, or was there something darker lurking behind them? The drawings themselves were not simple sketches. They were intricate, deliberate, almost otherworldly in their design. Some looked like ancient runes, others like geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. Some of the symbols resembled religious icons, while others appeared entirely alien, as though they belonged to a language from another time or dimension. Some scholars suggested that these symbols were nothing more than the product of deranged minds, their random patterns born from confusion and madness. But others were not so sure. Could there have been something more? Was there a deeper meaning that had eluded both the patients who created them and the doctors who observed them? Was this a message from the past, a clue to something that had been forgotten? To this day, the mystery of the Lisbon Asylum remains unsolved. The symbols continue to haunt the minds of those who study them. For some, they represent the ultimate failure of the asylum system, a dark chapter in the history of mental health treatment. For others, they are a symbol of something far more enigmatic, a cryptic riddle that challenges our understanding of the human mind. In the end, the only certainty is that these drawings, these symbols, have left an indelible mark on history. They remind us of the untold stories of those who suffered in silence, their voices lost to time, but whose experiences continue to echo in the dark corridors of the past. Perhaps the symbols hold the answer to a question we have yet to fully understand. Perhaps, buried in their twisted shapes and intricate designs, lies the key to unlocking a mystery that goes far beyond the asylum walls. Until then, we are left to ponder what the inmates of the Lisbon Asylum were trying to say, and why, after all these years, their strange symbols continue to haunt us. The Lisbon Asylum, officially known as the Hospital de Raridades, was established during a time when the very concept of mental illness was still in its nascent stages of understanding. It was a place that stood as a monument to the bewildering and often horrific state of psychiatric care in the late 19th century. Back then, the realm of mental health was not one of science or therapy, but of conjecture, fear, and ignorance. Asylums were less about healing and more about containment, locking away those deemed mad from the prying eyes of society. The buildings themselves, dark and imposing, seemed to reflect the nature of their purpose: confinement, isolation, and secrecy. Lisbon in the mid-1800s was a city caught between tradition and modernity. The rapid industrialization sweeping across Europe had not fully reached Portugal, leaving the country with many of its old-world methods in place, particularly in the realm of healthcare. Yet even as new medical practices began to develop, the understanding of mental illness remained stagnant. It was still widely believed that mental disorders were manifestations of moral failings, divine punishment, or even demonic possession. The people who were confined to institutions like the Lisbon Asylum were often there because they were seen as threats to the social order. These patients, poor, destitute, or marginalized, were often left to suffer in silence, away from public scrutiny. At the time, psychiatry was far from the well-established field it is today. Many psychiatric practices were rooted in superstition and crude methodologies. Theories about mental illness were still heavily influenced by ancient ideas of humors and the belief in a person's inherent nature being the source of their affliction. The prevailing attitude was that insanity could be cured or at least controlled through methods like isolation, restraint, and painful interventions, most of which lacked any real scientific foundation. Electric shock therapy had not yet been invented, and medication was primitive at best. For the patients at the Lisbon Asylum, the future was bleak. The treatments offered were often more damaging than helpful, further entrenching the belief that mental illness was not just a medical condition, but a punishment. The institution itself was built to house a growing number of patients who had nowhere else to go. It was a place for the homeless, the impoverished, the mentally ill, and even those with physical disabilities that were deemed unnatural or socially unacceptable. The building was designed to house hundreds, but overcrowding was a constant issue. Patients were often housed in tight, oppressive quarters, their rooms cold and bare, with little to no personal care or attention. The corridors echoed with the sounds of hopelessness, distant cries, frantic pacing, and the occasional muffled sob. Despite its official mandate as a medical facility, the Lisbon Asylum functioned more as a warehouse for human suffering, a place where those deemed unfit for society were left to wither away. Within this grim environment, the boundaries between patient and physician were blurred. The doctors, some of whom were well-intentioned, were limited by the medical knowledge of the time. They believed that the mind was something separate from the body, and therefore mental illness was a mystery, one that could not be fully understood or treated. Much of the care provided involved keeping patients physically restrained or heavily sedated, hoping that isolation would eventually cure them. The practice of physical restraint, often using iron chains or straitjackets, was common, as was the use of harsh methods like cold baths or the controversial practice of bloodletting. The overall treatment was not focused on rehabilitation or care, but rather on the idea that madness could be suppressed, if not eradicated altogether. The doctors who worked in the asylum at that time were not bad people. Many were simply products of their time. They relied on their best understanding of the human mind, which was extremely limited. Psychiatrists were beginning to make inroads into the study of mental illness, but they lacked the tools, theories, and understanding that we take for granted today. The medical staff was divided, some embracing emerging theories in psychiatry, while others adhered to older, more superstitious views about mental illness. As a result, the patients' conditions were often left unchecked, their minds left to deteriorate further. Some were subjected to experiments that had no basis in reality, while others were simply forgotten, left to rot in their cells. It was in this oppressive environment that the strange and enigmatic drawings began to appear. The asylum's walls became a canvas, but not for artistic expression, rather for the inner turmoil of the inmates. No one knows exactly when or how the symbols first appeared. Some claim they were drawn by a single individual, who was then copied by others. Others suggest that the patients, isolated in their own suffering, had some sort of collective vision, with each one channeling the same dark imagery through their art. Either way, the drawings were unmistakable, recurring in various forms throughout the institution, often appearing in places that were completely inaccessible to the patients. Inmates would draw these symbols over and over again, intricate shapes and strange, cryptic marks that seemed to have no logical connection to the world around them. The symbols, once discovered, posed a puzzle to the doctors who were still struggling to make sense of the human mind. Were these marks a form of communication, an expression of suffering, or something more mysterious? The doctors debated furiously. Some suggested that the drawings were the result of delusional thinking, patients caught in the grip of hallucinations or psychosis, but others began to question this explanation. The drawings were too detailed, too intricate to be the result of random mental breakdowns. They were not just incoherent scribbles. They were deliberate, carefully crafted images that seemed to have a rhythm, a pattern that could not easily be dismissed. They were not the work of mere lunatics, but of minds that were grappling with something deeper, something beyond simple insanity. As the days went on, more and more drawings appeared. The doctors, intrigued but perplexed, began to study the symbols in greater detail. They kept the drawings in the asylum's records, where they remained catalogued but largely ignored. The asylum was a place where patients were treated with minimal care, and the symbols were never truly explored, at least not to the extent they would be in the future. The doctor's fascination with the drawings was limited by the time period's restrictive understanding of mental illness. Without the modern tools of psychology, psychiatry, and neurological science, they could do little more than document the bizarre phenomenon. They made notes, theorized, and then moved on to the next patient. As time passed, the asylum faded into obscurity. Lisbon itself evolved, and the medical field began to make significant advancements. Treatments became more humane, and institutions like the Lisbon Asylum were slowly phased out or restructured. The records of the asylum, once carefully preserved, became lost to time, hidden in the dusty archives of forgotten buildings. For years, the mystery of the symbols lay dormant as the asylum's dark history was swallowed by the march of time. The drawings were forgotten, along with the stories of those who had created them. The names of the patients who had drawn these symbols, their lives, and their suffering faded into the mists of history. Yet, as with many forgotten stories, the past is never truly gone. The drawings, the asylum, and its secrets were rediscovered in the 21st century. Scholars and historians, armed with modern tools and a greater understanding of psychology, began to sift through the long-lost records. They uncovered the asylum's records, buried under years of dust and neglect, and with them, the strange symbols that had been left behind. What had once been a mystery of medical ignorance became, in the hands of modern researchers, a window into a forgotten world, a world of suffering, secrecy, and confusion. But even as new questions emerged, the answers remained as elusive as ever. The Lisbon Asylum had been a place where the human mind was trapped in a maze of darkness and misunderstanding. The patients who entered its gates were often left to rot in a system that was more concerned with controlling their bodies than understanding their minds. In a way, the symbols they left behind were a testament to the failure of that system. They were a cry for help, a plea from the depths of human suffering that no one had been able to hear. But even as the asylum faded away, those symbols remained. They stood as a reminder of the past, of a time when the boundaries between sanity and madness were blurred, and the true nature of the human mind was still a mystery. The forgotten asylum files were a discovery that would send ripples through the world of psychiatric history, shedding light on a mystery that had lain dormant for over a century. They were unearthed in a quiet corner of Lisbon's historical archives, gathering dust alongside other long-forgotten relics of the past. The case files had been sealed away, locked behind layers of bureaucracy and neglect, their contents hidden from the world. They told the stories of countless patients, their names and struggles buried in the pages of aging records. Among these forgotten files, however, was something that caught the attention of those who stumbled upon them. Something peculiar, strange, and unsettling. The repeated symbols, the same intricate drawings appearing again and again, created by different patients at different times. What was most curious was that these drawings were not mere random sketches or the incoherent scribbles of the mentally ill. These were deliberate, carefully constructed symbols, eerily similar in design, almost as if they had been passed from mind to mind or shared in some strange collective manner. The files themselves were thick with old medical jargon and dense reports. The first few pages of each case study appeared as though they had been written in haste, a rushed account of the patient's arrival at the asylum. Doctors and nurses noted the symptoms of madness in their patients, the kind of vague language that typified psychiatric assessments of the time. There were references to hysteria, melancholia, mania, and delusion. Words that were little more than catch-alls for conditions that modern science would later come to understand as a complex web of mental and neurological disorders. But among the sterile, clinical descriptions of illness, the symbols stood out. They were not discussed in any meaningful depth, only mentioned in passing small notations in the margins or brief references in the notes of doctors. Yet, for all their brevity, they were there. A pattern that no one could ignore, though no one knew what to make of it. Each file revealed new details about the patients who had drawn the symbols. Some of the names had faded with time, their ink smeared or erased, leaving only shadows of the individuals who had once lived and suffered within the asylum's walls. Others had left behind fragments of their personal histories. Some were born into poor, destitute families. Others were more privileged, yet equally tormented by their minds. Many of these individuals had been sent to the asylum by their families, who could no longer bear the weight of their mental illness. Their backgrounds were varied: farmers, merchants, teachers, and even some who held respected positions in society. But regardless of their class or occupation, they were all bound by one common thread. They had been deemed insane by the standards of their time, and they had been discarded into the asylum as the world turned its back on them. The drawings themselves were first noted by Dr. Almeida, one of the asylum's senior physicians. He had come across them while reviewing the case files of his patients. What struck him was not the quality of the drawings. After all, many patients had been encouraged to draw as a form of therapy, but the fact that these symbols appeared with such startling consistency. At first, he thought it a coincidence, merely the product of some collective delusion. But as he examined more and more case studies, he began to realize that the same shapes, the same marks, the same intricate designs kept cropping up. They were not all identical, but the similarities were unmistakable. The symbols seemed to take on different forms depending on the patient, but their essence remained unchanged. The patterns were too deliberate, too structured to be dismissed as meaningless. They felt deliberate, as if the patients had intentionally created these shapes, as if they were trying to convey something. Almeida's notes on the drawings were sparse. He did not know what to make of them, and so he wrote only a brief mention in each case study. But to those who would later come across the files, these few words held a sense of mystery and urgency. Strange symbols drawn repeatedly in patients' journals, Almeida wrote in the margin of one report. Patient shows no signs of comprehension of the marks. The doctor's words were perfunctory, as if he was simply noting an odd behavior rather than documenting a phenomenon that would later capture the imagination of historians and scholars. Yet, even in his dispassionate language, there was an underlying sense of unease, a hint that something was not quite right. As more files were examined, the symbols began to take on new significance. The patterns started to reveal themselves, and researchers began to speculate about their possible meaning. Some of the drawings resembled intricate geometric shapes, circles and triangles intertwined with lines and angles. Others appeared to be more abstract, with spirals and jagged lines, creating an unsettling sense of chaos. There were repeated motifs, such as overlapping circles or star-like patterns that seemed to converge on a central point, as if they were trying to communicate a singular idea. Some symbols resembled ancient runes or occult markings, while others bore no resemblance to anything known in contemporary culture or history. The variety was vast, yet the consistency of certain elements was undeniable. Each time researchers examined a new file, they found something familiar, something that tied the symbols together, like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming into focus. One of the most perplexing aspects of these drawings was their uncanny resemblance to symbols used in ancient cultures, particularly those associated with mysticism, the occult, and early forms of religious iconography. Some scholars believed that the symbols were an expression of the patient's own struggles with their mental states, a way to externalize their suffering through art. But others posited that the symbols might have had a deeper, more esoteric significance. Could these drawings have been a form of secret communication? Were the patients attempting to convey something to each other, something beyond the grasp of their caretakers? There were suggestions that the symbols could be an expression of some shared belief or hallucination, a form of collective psychosis. However, the sheer variety of the patients and the differences in their backgrounds made it difficult to believe that this was the case. After all, some patients had no prior connection to one another, and many had arrived at the asylum from different parts of Lisbon, or even other regions of Portugal. As the investigation deepened, theories began to proliferate. Some believed that the drawings were a manifestation of the patient's collective fear and frustration, a subconscious reaction to the oppressive conditions of the asylum. It was widely known that many patients suffered from hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia, and it seemed possible that the symbols were nothing more than the products of these altered states of mind. Others suggested that the symbols might represent a form of resistance, a subconscious rebellion against the institution that held them captive. Perhaps these markings were an expression of the patient's desire to communicate something, anything, to the outside world. In a place where their voices had been silenced, the drawings were their only means of expression. Yet, despite all the theories, no one could truly explain the strange and haunting consistency of the symbols. They did not fit neatly into any known category of mental illness. They did not seem to be random or senseless, nor did they appear to be the product of individual delusion. They were something else, something more profound, more mysterious. Over time, these symbols came to represent the unknown, the unspoken, the hidden truth that had been locked away in the asylum's archives. They became a symbol of the dark history of psychiatric care, a history filled with secrets, suffering, and unanswered questions. As the files continued to be examined, it became clear that the mystery of the symbols would not be easily solved. Each new file only deepened the enigma. Was there a link between the patients who drew these symbols, or were the drawings simply an arbitrary phenomenon? Could the symbols have been the product of the human mind's deepest recesses, expressing a primal truth that was beyond words? Or was there something more sinister at play, something hidden in the darkness of the asylum's past that had left its mark on the minds of those who entered its doors? The answers, it seemed, were lost to time, locked away with the patients themselves. The rediscovery of the asylum files was a moment of reckoning, not just for the field of psychiatry, but for the long-forgotten lives of those who had suffered within the institution. The symbols, enigmatic and haunting, were a testament to their pain and their suffering. They had been forgotten for so long, their stories buried in the dust of history. But now, thanks to the recovery of these files, they were coming back to life. The symbols, strange and cryptic, had waited patiently for their moment to be revealed. They had been silent for over a century, but now they were speaking, if only we could understand what they were trying to say. The symbols themselves were a riddle that no one could truly unravel, and yet, in their intricate lines and strange geometries, they seemed to speak volumes. When the drawings first came to light, they were simple, almost crude in their execution, drawn hastily on scraps of paper or the walls of the asylum cells. But the more one looked at them, the more they seemed to demand attention. There was a deliberate quality to the shapes. Each curve, each angle, each mark appeared to have been carefully considered, as though the inmates had a purpose behind their drawings, a message they were trying to convey. The symbols were not merely chaotic doodles or the product of a mind lost in delirium. There was an underlying structure, a consistency that was undeniable. Some symbols resembled simple geometric shapes, like circles, triangles, and squares. Others were more complex, forming intricate patterns that seemed to defy logic. Lines intersected at sharp angles, spirals twisted in on themselves, and symbols seemed to echo one another in a way that suggested a hidden logic or meaning. They were almost like a language, one that had no words, only images. A visual code, perhaps, that only those who had experienced the same suffering could understand. At first glance, the drawings might seem like nothing more than the confused outpourings of mentally ill minds. But the more the symbols were studied, the more they seemed to transcend mere madness. They had a quality that was almost hypnotic, a draw that made those who studied them feel as if they were standing on the precipice of something vast and unknowable. Some observers believed that the symbols were a form of expression, an attempt to give shape to the internal chaos that raged within the minds of the patients. They could be seen as an attempt to externalize the pain, the fear, the confusion that these individuals felt. In a world where they were silenced by their illness, the symbols gave them a voice, a way to communicate something profound, something primal. The strange thing about these symbols was that they were not confined to a single patient or even to a single group of patients. They appeared across different individuals at different times, often by people who had no direct contact with one another. One patient might draw a simple spiral, while another might sketch a complex geometric shape composed of overlapping circles and squares. But when these drawings were compared, the similarities became evident. Despite the differences in the execution, The core patterns, triangular shapes, intersecting lines, circular motifs, were consistent. There were variations, yes, but the essence of the symbols remained the same, as if they were part of some unspoken visual language that transcended individual experience. It was not just the shapes themselves that intrigued those who studied the drawings. It was also the way they were drawn. The lines were not erratic or shaky, as one might expect from someone in the throes of a mental breakdown. Instead, they were bold, confident strokes, carefully rendered and meticulously repeated. Some of the drawings had a sense of rhythm to them, almost as if the artist had been compelled by some invisible force to draw the same symbol again and again, perfecting it with each iteration. The patients did not just draw these symbols once and move on. They returned to them time and time again, adding new layers, refining the shapes, repeating the motifs until they became almost obsessive in nature. One of the most striking aspects of the symbols was their eerie, otherworldly quality. They did not resemble anything that was commonly seen in the everyday world. No one could point to any specific cultural or religious iconography that directly matched the symbols. Some of them had elements that vaguely resembled ancient runes or mystical sigils, but there were no exact matches in any known system of writing or symbolism. The closest comparisons were to the symbols used in early occult practices, where geometric shapes were thought to hold mystical power, or to ancient cultures that believed in the sacredness of certain numbers and patterns. But even then, the similarities were tenuous at best. The symbols felt like they were something outside of history, something timeless, as if they had come from a place beyond human understanding. Some of the drawings seemed to feature elements of symmetry, with lines radiating out from a central point, creating patterns that resembled stars or suns. Others were more abstract, with jagged edges and sharp angles that gave the impression of dissonance and chaos. These symbols did not speak in words. They spoke through their form, through the emotions they evoked. There was a sense of unease in looking at them, a sense that they were something more than mere marks on paper. They seemed to hold a secret, something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The geometric shapes, circles, triangles, squares, spirals, seemed to recur most often in the symbols, suggesting that these forms held some special significance. Circles, in particular, were a common motif, appearing in a variety of configurations. They could be seen as symbols of unity, wholeness, or eternity, but in the context of the asylum, they took on a different meaning. The circle could be seen as a representation of the closed, inescapable world in which these patients were trapped. It was a symbol of confinement, of being trapped in a cycle with no way out. Perhaps this was how the patients saw their own lives, trapped in endless loops of suffering, with no possibility of escape. Other shapes, such as triangles and squares, seemed to suggest structure, order, and logic. Yet there was a certain dissonance to these shapes as well. Triangles are often associated with the idea of stability, yet the way they appeared in the drawings was anything but stable. They were often skewed, warped, or fragmented, as though their inherent order had been broken. This could have been a reflection of the patient's fractured mental states, their perception of the world around them as a place that no longer made sense. The spirals, too, were an intriguing feature. Spirals are often associated with concepts of growth, expansion, and evolution, but in the asylum drawings, they took on a more sinister tone. The spirals seemed to wind endlessly inward, a never-ending descent into chaos, perhaps symbolizing the patient's own descent into madness. The spirals had no end, no resolution. They turned in on themselves, over and over, as if to emphasize the cyclical nature of the patient's suffering. Perhaps they saw themselves as trapped in a spiral of madness, unable to break free, repeating the same patterns over and over again in an attempt to make sense of their fractured world. The recurring motifs in the drawings suggested that the symbols had a significance beyond their surface appearance. These were not just random marks or meaningless scribbles. They were carefully constructed, deeply symbolic shapes, each one layered with meaning. The more one examined the symbols, the more it became apparent that they were trying to communicate something that could not be put into words. Was it a cry for help? A plea for release from the torment of their minds? Or was it something deeper still? Something that transcended the boundaries of the human mind and entered into a realm of the unknown? What makes these drawings even more intriguing is the fact that they were created by a wide variety of patients, people from different walks of life, with different backgrounds, personalities, and experiences. And yet, despite their differences, these individuals had all drawn the same or similar symbols. Some were men, others women. Some were young, others old. Some had been institutionalized for decades, while others were recent arrivals. And yet, they all seemed to share this common thread. Could it be that the symbols were a form of communication, a shared language of the mind? Could it be that the patients were somehow tapping into a collective unconscious, a deep, primal reservoir of symbols that spoke to the core of their being? Or were they simply a reflection of the shared trauma of life within the asylum walls, a way for these individuals to express their isolation, their fear, their pain? The more one studied the symbols, the more they seemed to defy logic and explanation. They were a mystery that resisted easy interpretation. Some believed that they were the product of the patient's madness, that they were simply the ramblings of deranged minds. But others saw them as something much more profound. The symbols felt like a message, an encoded message that, if deciphered, could reveal something about the very nature of human consciousness, the mind's ability to manifest its deepest fears, desires, and truths in the form of abstract shapes and patterns. The symbols were a puzzle, one that still eludes modern researchers to this day. And yet, they continue to haunt us, their strange beauty and cryptic meaning drawing us into a world of mystery and wonder. As the symbols were analyzed further, the question that began to occupy the minds of those studying them was not just what they represented, but why these particular symbols had emerged in the minds of these patients. What did it mean for so many individuals, isolated by their afflictions, to create the same symbols, to draw similar shapes in different corners of the asylum at different times? Was there a deeper, hidden connection between the patients, or was this simply the product of a shared environment that had shaped their experiences in such a way that they began to mirror one another's suffering? One of the key theories that emerged among the researchers was that the symbols were a form of shared subconscious expression. It was believed that the patients, despite their isolation, were tapping into some kind of collective unconscious, a concept that had been popularized by the psychologist Carl Jung. Jung theorized that all human beings share an underlying structure of the psyche, a reservoir of archetypes and symbols that connect us to the past, to the deeper, more primal parts of our existence. These symbols, according to this theory, might not have been drawn randomly or by chance. Instead, they were the manifestation of something more profound, perhaps even an ancient language of the mind, a language that spoke of deep, universal truths about the human condition, about suffering, fear, and the fragility of the self. This idea that the symbols were a form of communication, a visual language that could bridge the gap between the patient's fractured minds and the outside world, captured the imagination of many. The patterns, with their geometric precision, their recurring themes of circles, triangles, and spirals, suggested that the patients were not simply acting out their delusions in a random or incoherent manner. Instead, they were expressing something that could be understood, if only one could decode the message. But decoding this message proved to be a far more difficult task than anyone could have imagined. The symbols themselves were puzzling not only in their shapes, but in the way they seemed to transcend individual experience. Some of the patients who created these drawings had never met one another, and yet the similarity in the symbols could not be ignored. It raised the question of whether there was some deeper, unspoken connection between them. Was it possible that, despite being isolated from one another, the patients were somehow linked, sharing a kind of mental or emotional resonance that led them to draw the same symbols? Was there a collective psychological force at play, one that operated beneath the surface of their conscious minds? And if so, could this force reveal something about the nature of human consciousness itself? Something that had been lost to time, something that had been buried in the shadows of history. While some researchers focused on the possibility of a collective unconscious, others turned their attention to the more immediate and practical factors that might have contributed to the emergence of these symbols. The asylum itself, after all, was an environment rife with fear, deprivation, and suffering. Patients were subjected to isolation, mistreatment, and the harshest of medical practices. It was not a place of healing but of containment. The asylum was a microcosm of suffering, a place where the mind's fragility was on full display, where the patients were abandoned to confront the deepest recesses of their minds without the tools to understand or manage what they were experiencing. Could it be that these symbols were simply an expression of the patient's desperation? Were they trying, in their own fractured ways, to make sense of their suffering, to put it into a form that could somehow be understood? The environment of the asylum certainly played a significant role in shaping the minds of the patients who were sent there. It was a place of stark, oppressive confinement, where individuals were cut off from the outside world and left to languish in their own mental isolation. This isolation was not just physical. It was emotional, psychological, and social. The patients were disconnected from their families, from society, and from any sense of normalcy. They were often treated like animals, confined to their cells, ignored or mistreated by the very people who were supposed to care for them. In such an environment, the mind, left to its own devices, can unravel in strange ways. But there was another layer to this mystery, an even darker possibility. The patient's isolation was not merely a backdrop to their suffering. It was a deliberate, controlled aspect of their treatment. The asylum was not just a place of confinement, it was a place of experimentation. The doctors, limited by their rudimentary understanding of psychiatry, often resorted to primitive and invasive treatments in an attempt to cure or control the minds of their patients. Many were subjected to violent methods, such as electroshock therapy, water immersion, and even bloodletting. Others were forced into isolation rooms, stripped of their dignity and subjected to sensory deprivation. The cruelty of these treatments may have been a contributing factor to the emergence of the strange symbols. In such a brutal environment, the mind would have been pushed to extremes. Could the symbols be a result of the patient's mind trying to make sense of the horrors they experienced? Were these drawings an unconscious effort to take control of the pain, to create a new order in a world that had been turned upside down? It was possible that the symbols were born from the patient's attempts to assert some semblance of control over their fractured realities. But if the symbols were a form of expression, what were they trying to communicate? Were they simply a reflection of the patient's inner turmoil? Or did they hold deeper meaning, perhaps a truth about the nature of the mind, about the nature of suffering, that had yet to be uncovered? The symbols' eerie resemblance to certain mystical and occult symbols has only fueled these speculations. In the years since the discovery of the asylum files, many scholars have pointed out that the shapes, especially the geometric patterns and the concentric circles, bear a striking resemblance to symbols used in ancient occult practices, religious iconography, and even sacred geometry. These symbols, which have been found across various cultures and religions, are often associated with spiritual knowledge, enlightenment, and hidden truths. Could the symbols drawn by the patients have been a form of unconscious expression of these ancient symbols, a way of connecting with something larger than themselves? Were they tapping into a hidden wisdom, a primal knowledge buried deep within the human psyche that could not be understood in the rational terms of the time? Others have argued that the symbols were a form of psychological defense, a way for the patients to cope with the trauma and despair that consumed them. The patients who were sent to the asylum were often those who had been broken by their experiences in the world. They had suffered from abuse, neglect, and abandonment. Their minds had been pushed to the brink by the harshness of the world they had known, and the asylum was just another form of cruelty they were forced to endure. In this light, the symbols could be seen as an attempt to reclaim something from the chaos, a way to make sense of the incomprehensible suffering they had endured. It was as though they had created their own visual language to express their pain and their resistance to the forces that had broken them. The fact that the symbols appeared again and again in the notebooks of patients from all walks of life further deepened the mystery. Some of the patients had been admitted due to conditions like depression, while others had been committed for more severe disorders like schizophrenia or mania. Despite their vastly different diagnoses, they all seemed to have created similar symbols. It was almost as though these symbols existed outside of the boundaries of mental illness, as if they were tapping into something more fundamental, a universal language that transcended the labels of diagnosis and disorder. Some researchers have speculated that the symbols were an expression of a deep, shared psychic experience, one that cut across the individual experiences of the patients and pointed to something common to all of them. It was as if the patients, despite their isolation, were trying to communicate with one another, trying to reach out from within the confines of their madness to share something of immense importance. What that something was, however, remains a mystery. Could it have been an attempt to bridge the gap between their fractured minds and the reality outside? Or was it something more? Something that connected them to a deeper, more universal truth? The cryptic nature of the symbols, their alien quality, left them open to a wide range of interpretations. They could be seen as a reflection of the patients' inner lives, a manifestation of their confusion, their pain, and their alienation. But they could also be seen as something more, a message from the past, from a time long forgotten, that spoke of something far larger than the individual. These symbols, in their mystery, hold within them the possibility of unlocking a deeper understanding of the human mind, one that transcends the limits of time, language, and culture. Yet, despite all the theories and speculation, the true meaning of the symbols remains as elusive as ever, a puzzle that, perhaps, we are not yet ready to solve. As the strange symbols continued to surface within the asylum's forgotten files, they began to attract the attention of individuals beyond the initial historians and psychiatric researchers. Psychologists, occultists, and even individuals fascinated by the paranormal began to converge on the mystery. Each group brought its own lens, its own set of beliefs, and its own interpretations to the table. For some, the symbols were a key to unlocking the hidden recesses of the human mind, a visual manifestation of the deeper layers of the unconscious. For others, the symbols were something much more esoteric, perhaps a message, or even a warning, passed through time and space, waiting to be decoded. As the years passed, and the asylum faded further into the annals of forgotten history, new theories continued to evolve about what the symbols truly meant. The discovery of the symbols sparked a resurgence in the study of occultism. The shapes, with their geometric precision and intricate design, bore an uncanny resemblance to ancient symbols associated with occult practices, sacred geometry, and even early alchemical symbols. Those who dabbled in the esoteric arts were immediately drawn to the idea that these symbols were not just random drawings, but a form of hidden knowledge. They argued that the shapes had been passed down through time, through secret societies, or even through mystical traditions, and that the patients of the asylum, whether by intention or by some kind of shared unconscious connection, had somehow tapped into this ancient system of symbols. At the heart of these interpretations was the idea that the symbols were more than just mental constructs. They were keys to hidden knowledge. Some occultists even suggested that these shapes were related to the secret geometry of the universe itself, a code that could unlock the mysteries of existence. Many pointed to the recurrent use of spirals, circles, and other sacred shapes, which were staples of ancient mystical systems. Spirals, for example, had been used in many cultures to represent the journey of the soul, the cyclical nature of existence, and the connection between the material world and the spiritual realm. The idea that the patients of the Lisbon asylum had somehow been able to tap into these ancient symbols struck a deep chord with those who believed in the power of symbols to influence the mind and the universe. While some focused on the spiritual significance of the symbols, others turned their attention to their psychological implications. Could the repeated use of these specific symbols be a sign of a common mental state, one that transcended individual diagnosis and instead pointed to a universal experience of the mind in distress? The geometric shapes and repetitive patterns could be interpreted as a sign of the mind trying to restore order to chaos. In an environment as harsh and oppressive as the asylum, where the patients were subjected to harsh treatments and isolation, the mind could have retreated into itself, trying to impose order on the disarray of their thoughts and emotions. These patients, many of whom had been institutionalized for years, may have been experiencing a deep sense of internal fragmentation. The symbols could be seen as an attempt to bring coherence to the chaos in their minds, a visual representation of their subconscious struggle for control over their deteriorating mental states. The repeated nature of the symbols was especially telling. The patients did not just draw these shapes once, they returned to them over and over again, refining the patterns, deepening their complexity. It was as if the act of drawing the symbols gave them a sense of control, a way to reassert themselves in a world that had taken everything from them. This repetition could have been an unconscious coping mechanism, a way for the patients to hold on to something constant in the face of a world that offered them no stability. It suggested a desire for order, even in the midst of mental turmoil. There was something profoundly human about this. The need to create meaning out of suffering, to find patterns in the chaos of life. But beyond the psychological and esoteric explanations, the most chilling aspect of the symbols was their connection to the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that permeated the asylum. For the patients, the asylum was a place of confinement and isolation, a place where they were removed from society and cut off from any semblance of normal life. In such an environment, the symbols could be interpreted as a reflection of the terror and helplessness that the patients felt. They were trapped in a world of incomprehensible suffering, with no way to escape or understand their pain. The asylum's harsh treatments, the constant isolation, the absence of any real care, all of these factors may have contributed to the patient's need to express their agony in some form. The symbols, with their sharp lines and intricate designs, could be seen as a form of visual scream, a desperate attempt to make sense of a world that had driven them to the edge of madness. One of the most disturbing aspects of the discovery of these symbols was the idea that they might have been passed from one patient to another. If one patient began drawing a particular symbol, was it possible that others, in their isolation and suffering, began to draw the same symbol without ever having been told to? Could the symbols have been passed along in some sort of unspoken, unconscious transmission? There were reports from the asylum's staff that some patients who had never met each other seemed to draw the same shapes independently, as though they had absorbed the designs from their fellow inmates through some kind of collective unconscious connection. This idea struck a deep chord with those who believed in the power of shared mental experiences and the idea that the mind, even in isolation, could reach out to others in ways that defied explanation. Some researchers suggested that the symbols were not just the result of individual madness, but of something more collective, something larger than any single mind. The asylum, after all, had housed a great number of individuals over the years, and many of the patients had been there for long periods of time, often decades. Could it be that the isolation, the suffering, and the mental disarray caused by the asylum's treatments had triggered a kind of collective psychosis, one that manifested itself in these strange, recurring symbols? Could it be that the asylum, as a microcosm of madness, had created a shared mental landscape where the patients' subconscious minds could communicate with each other through these drawings? It was a chilling thought, one that suggested that the symbols were not merely the products of isolated individuals, but of a collective, shared experience of insanity. The longer the symbols were studied, the more it became clear that their meaning was elusive, perhaps intentionally so. They seemed to transcend the boundaries of individual experience, pointing to something larger, something beyond the patient's personal struggles. Were these symbols an attempt to communicate with a higher power? Were they a form of spiritual or mystical expression? Or were they simply the tortured products of minds so broken that they could only communicate through a language of suffering? Whatever their origins, the symbols were undeniably powerful. They seemed to resonate with anyone who looked at them, regardless of their background or beliefs. There was a quality to the symbols that made them impossible to ignore, a sense of urgency and mystery that left those who studied them feeling as if they were on the brink of something significant, yet unable to grasp its true meaning. In the years following the discovery of the asylum files, the symbols began to take on a life of their own. Researchers, psychologists, and occultists all contributed their interpretations, each offering their own theories about what the symbols represented. Some saw them as a manifestation of the patient's attempts to find meaning in a world of suffering, while others viewed them as an expression of deep psychological pain. Still, others saw them as something more supernatural, an attempt to tap into hidden knowledge or a form of communication with forces beyond the human mind. But no matter how they were interpreted, the symbols remained as elusive as ever, a mystery that refused to be solved. The asylum, once a place of suffering and silence, had become the epicenter of a strange and fascinating mystery. The patients who had once been discarded as madmen and women were now at the heart of a story that bridged the realms of history, psychology, and the supernatural. The symbols they had left behind, strange, cryptic, and haunting, had become a testament to the complexity of the human mind, to the depths of suffering, and to the unspoken truths that lurk in the shadows of the human psyche. Despite the passage of time, despite the fading of the asylum into obscurity, the symbols remain, waiting to be understood, waiting to reveal their secrets. Whether they are the product of a tortured mind, a collective unconscious, or something far stranger, they continue to captivate and intrigue, reminding us that there are mysteries in this world that are far beyond our comprehension. As the years passed and the asylum remained a faded memory in the hearts of the city's residents, the symbols continued to linger in the minds of those who had encountered them. They became a haunting enigma, a puzzle that refused to be solved, echoing the very isolation and despair that had once gripped the minds of the patients. Yet, as the mystery deepened, there were those who believed the asylum's history, and by extension, the symbols themselves, held the key to understanding not only the patient's suffering, but something much larger, something that transcended time and space. In the years following the rediscovery of the asylum files, those symbols, once seen as the ramblings of the insane, began to gain a new life. They were no longer just marks on paper. They became symbols of something greater, of human suffering, of unspoken truths, and of the silent voices that had long been ignored by history. The asylum, with its crumbling walls and forgotten halls, had always been a place of neglect, a place where the mentally ill were relegated to the margins of society. For years, it had served as a prison for those whose minds had shattered under the weight of their experiences. Yet, in the wake of the symbols' discovery, the asylum became something else. It became a place of intrigue, a place that demanded answers, a place where the whispers of its past could no longer be ignored. And the symbols, in particular, became the key to unlocking those answers. As scholars, psychologists, and occultists began to pore over the asylum's records, they started to connect the dots between the strange symbols and the broader cultural context in which they had emerged. It became clear that the symbols were not just a product of the patient's mental illnesses, but were somehow linked to the time and place in which they had been created. Lisbon in the late 19th century was a city in the midst of tremendous change, a city where old-world traditions were being challenged by new scientific and philosophical ideas. The city was caught between two worlds, one rooted in the old superstitious beliefs that had dominated the Iberian Peninsula for centuries, and another shaped by the rapidly advancing understanding of science and reason. In this atmosphere of cultural tension, the asylum and its patients became a reflection of the larger struggles taking place within society. At the time, psychiatry was still in its infancy. The asylum's doctors and caretakers had only a rudimentary understanding of mental illness, and their treatments were often crude and inhumane. Patients were subjected to brutal forms of therapy, including bloodletting, restraint, and the use of isolation cells. Many of the patients who entered the asylum were already broken by the time they arrived, either from poverty, abuse, or the trauma of war. The symbols, then, could be seen as a reflection of the intense psychological strain these individuals were under. They were not just the product of disordered minds. They were an attempt to make sense of the senselessness, an attempt to find order in a world that had been reduced to chaos. The symbols could also be viewed as a response to the isolation that the patients experienced. Many of them were placed in solitary confinement for long periods, cut off from the world and from each other. It is during such extreme isolation that the mind often resorts to creating patterns, attempting to establish some semblance of control over an environment that is completely foreign. For these patients, the asylum was not just a physical space, it was a psychological one. The symbols were their way of asserting agency in a world that sought to strip them of their humanity. They were the product of minds trying to piece together their shattered realities, searching for some kind of logic or order amidst the cruelty of their treatment. While some saw the symbols as a form of expression, others believed they were a form of communication. There were whispers among the asylum staff that certain patients would share their symbols with one another in hushed tones, as if they were part of some secret language, a code that only those within the asylum's walls could understand. These drawings were not simply random. They were deliberate, and many of the patients who drew them seemed to take great care in their execution. The repeated patterns, the careful attention to detail, suggested that the symbols held meaning, a meaning that the patients themselves understood, but that eluded those who looked at them from the outside. Could it be that the patients were speaking to one another through these symbols, communicating in a way that was beyond the understanding of the doctors and the staff? This idea of secret communication struck a chord with some who studied the symbols, particularly those interested in the occult and the paranormal. For them, the symbols were more than just visual representations of the patient's mental states. They were part of a larger, more mystical tradition, one that connected the patients to something outside of themselves. Some occultists believed that the symbols were evidence of a deeper hidden knowledge, one that had been passed down through the ages but had been lost to mainstream society. The fact that the symbols appeared in the minds of the patients, people who were often seen as disconnected from reality, suggested that they were tapping into something beyond the physical world, a kind of spiritual knowledge that had been buried in the collective unconscious of humanity. There were some who even believed that the symbols could have been part of an ancient, forgotten system of communication, one that predated written language. They pointed to the recurring use of geometric shapes, triangles, circles, and spirals, all of which had been used in ancient cultures as symbols of hidden truths. These symbols, they argued, were not the product of mental illness, but rather the remnants of an ancient system of knowledge that had been suppressed over time. The asylum's patients, isolated from society and left to their own devices, were in some ways closer to this ancient wisdom than the rest of the population. Their suffering, it was believed, allowed them to access hidden truths that others could not perceive. The most compelling evidence for this theory came from the fact that the symbols seemed to transcend the boundaries of individual experience. The patients who drew them were not connected by any obvious links. They were from different walks of life, different social classes, and different regions. They had arrived at the asylum for different reasons, and their conditions varied widely. And yet, despite these differences, they all seemed to draw the same symbols. It was as if they were all tapping into the same source of knowledge, one that lay beyond their individual experiences. This shared experience, this collective unconscious, seemed to suggest that there was something universal about the symbols, a truth that lay outside the realm of personal experience. But as the study of the symbols deepened, it became apparent that the mystery surrounding them was far from solved. No one could explain why the symbols appeared or what they meant. Despite the efforts of researchers, occultists, and psychologists, the true significance of the drawings remained elusive. Some believed that the symbols were simply a product of the patient's mental states, a manifestation of their suffering and isolation. Others believed that they were a form of secret knowledge, a hidden code that only the patients could decipher. Still, others argued that the symbols were a reflection of the asylum itself, a place of confinement, of suffering, of madness, where the boundaries between reality and illusion became blurred. And yet, despite all the theories and speculations, one thing remained certain. The symbols had a power. They had the power to captivate, to intrigue, to provoke thought and imagination. They spoke of something beyond the ordinary, something that lay just out of reach, waiting to be understood. In a way, the mystery of the symbols mirrored the very nature of the asylum itself, an enigma, a place of forgotten histories, lost voices, and unanswered questions. The asylum may have been abandoned, but the symbols continued to live on, echoing through time, waiting for someone to unlock their secret. As the years went by, the asylum files, once discarded and forgotten, were rediscovered, and the mystery of the symbols grew. The patients who had drawn them may have been long gone, their lives erased from the records, but their legacy endured. The symbols they left behind were not just marks on paper. They were a testament to their pain, their isolation, and their search for meaning in a world that had rejected them. Whether they were the product of a collective unconscious, a secret language, or simply the fractured minds of those who had suffered in silence, the symbols were a haunting reminder of the human capacity to endure, to create, and to search for meaning, even in the darkest of places.